everyone, welcome to Chetan Bharat Learning, and this class is for Polity Current Affairs from 19th of November to 26th of November. Alright, so the issues that we're going to cover in today's class will be Article 32, CBI and the general consent issue, Belgaum Dispute. We'll learn what the dispute between Maharashtra and Karnataka is. Then the most important topic that has been discussed around the country today is regulation of TV news, and we're going to learn what was the ordinance that Kerala government recently, only yesterday, withdrew, what that ordinance tried to do and why did it withdraw it. All right, we're going to learn these things. So let's start with Article 32. Now, the Chief Justice of India in a recent case made a comment that it is ideal that the high courts themselves deal with Article 30 with the petitions to deal with personal liberty instead of petitioners trying to employ Article 32 as a measure for doing it, right? So this has created quite a bit of controversy in newspapers. You must have heard about it, you must have read about it. So we're going to try and understand what is the controversy, what is Article 32 and what is Article 226 also, all right? Now the problem here, let's start with what's the point of Article 32, all right? So, I'm sure you must have come across the writ of habeas corpus, all right? Now, what does that writ say? It says that if a person has been abducted or has been taken away by the government, it is the duty of the government to produce that person within 24 hours of such an order in the court of a magistrate, all right? 24 hours is all they get, excluding the travel time, all right? Now, think about this as a right. The right is that a person has to be produced in the court of a magistrate within 24 hours. Now, this is a British concept, the writ of habeas corpus, right? At the same time, French constitutions also had rights such as right to liberty, right not to be abducted, and multiple other rights. A.V. Dicey, who also gave the concept of rule of law that you must come across in your regular polity text, said that this one habeas corpus right is worth 1,000 other rights that have been granted by so many other constitutions. Now, why did he say that? He said that because a right does not mean anything unless it is attached with a procedure for enforcement of that right, all right? Otherwise, rights just turn out to be hollow rights. Now, if you have a right and you don't know what to do about it, it doesn't really mean much, right? It's a hollow right. Now, on the same principle, the Part 3 of our Constitution provides us with a multitude, a battery of civil political rights, right? It says there's a right to equality. It says you have the right to worship your own God. It says there is a right to freedom. There is right to association. There are a multitude of rights that it provides us. Now, if someone is violating that right, including the state, what do you do about it? Now, that enforcement mechanism is provided by Article 32 of the Constitution. That's why our Constitution is in line with the maxim where there is a right, there is a remedy. All right. That is why Article 32 is such an important article in our Constitution, which is why Dr. Ambedkar, the chairman of the drafting committee of the Constitution, said that Article 32 is the heart and soul of the Constitution. Now you understand why he said that, all right? Now you need to know the clauses of this article. This is one of the most important articles in our Constitution. So that's why let's look at the clauses. Now, Clause 1 here says that the right to move to Supreme Court by appropriate proceedings for the enforcement of rights conferred by this part. What part? Part 3 is guaranteed. And this is the operative word here. It's guaranteed. There is no discretion involved in this. It's guaranteed. Like if you go there, the Supreme Court will have to answer to your call, all right? The Clause 2 here says the Clause 2 strengthens the Supreme Court's hand. It says in the enforcement of these rights that have been mentioned in Part 3 of the Constitution, the Supreme Court has the writs of mandamus, prohibition, quo warranto, certiorari, etc. for the enforcement of any of the rights conferred in Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, the Supreme Court has been told that they have to enforce these rights in Part 3, and the Supreme Court has been given the tools to do that, all right? In addition to all of this, the Parliament under Clause 3 has been given the power to lay upon any other court the jurisdiction to enforce these rights, right? So the Clause 3 essentially says that any other court that the Parliament by law declare shall have the same powers to enforce these rights by virtue of these rights within their jurisdiction. All right. Now, and clause 4, also a very important clause. It says that this right can be taken away, can be suspended only by way as provided under this constitution. Now, the constitution, you'll have to refer to Article 359. Under matters of national emergency, the president may by an order suspend the enforcement of certain rights. You'll have to focus on your polity classes for that. But this is broadly what Article 32 says, all right? Now, there is another article in the Constitution, which is Article 226. What Article 32 does for the Supreme Court, Article 226 does for the High Courts within their own jurisdictions, all right? However, there are important differences between the powers of the Supreme Court and the powers of the High Court with respect to enforcement of fundamental rights, okay? The first and foremost of these differences is that while Article 32 is within Part 3 of the Constitution, so Article 32 by itself, despite being a procedure, by itself is a fundamental right, whereas Article 226 is not in Part 3 of the Constitution. That's why it's just a constitutional right. All right. The second and rather important distinction is under what circumstances can you suspend these rights? Now, Article 32 can be suspended in Article 32, or enforcement of certain articles under Part 3 of the Constitution can be suspended under situations of national emergency, while the same does not apply to Article 226. All right. So even during our emergency, when we had an emergency, Article 226 was not suspended. All right. So that's why ADM Jabalpur, a lot of these petitions came from high courts. All right. Now, then the scope is important, very important. Please take a note of this. Violation of any of the fundamental rights under Part 3 is the domain of Article 32. All right. So Supreme Court can use Article 32 to enforce rights only and only mentioned in Part 3 of the Constitution. However, the High Court can not only enforce rights under Part 3 of the Constitution, but also many other rights that are in the Constitution. For example, there is some say a right to vote in the Constitution. There is some say the right to trade freely in the Constitution. The Supreme Court can use its powers also for other constitutional as well as other legal rights, right? The High Court can use that power, all right? Then the jurisdiction part of it. Supreme Court's jurisdiction is the entire country. High Court's jurisdiction is whatever state it's a high court for, all right? And attached union territories, if that is the case. For example, Kerala, you don't need to know the examples. For example, Calcutta High Court has the jurisdiction for Andaman and Nicobar Islands, that sort of thing, all right? Then, as I told you, discretion is important. Supreme Court does not have the discretion as to whether they need to enforce, whether they should apply Article 32 or not. It's guaranteed. Every citizen, if you're a citizen, can just walk up to the Supreme Court theoretically and claim your right, and the Supreme Court is bound to enforce your right. The High Courts are not bound by it. The High Courts need not enforce your rights. All right, so that's also why Article 32 is the heart and soul of our Constitution. Now, if you have a GS answer to write on Article 32, you would profit from writing this judgment. You could say in L. Chandrakumar versus Union of India, a 7-judge bench said that Article 32 is an integral and essential feature of the Constitution. Basically, they're talking about basic feature doctrine. It's a fundamental feature of our Constitution. Now, let's come to the current controversy. Now that you've understood what Article 32 says and its comparison with Article 226, now let's get a grip on what the controversy is, all right? Now, experts point out that Supreme Court hasn't been exactly very consistent in its enforcement of fundamental rights, all right? So, in some cases, the Supreme Court has said, why don't you get a remedy from the High Courts? Right? It said, use Article 226, go there and get a remedy from there. In other cases, the Supreme Court has granted the remedy under Article 32, right? For example, in the Arnab Goswami case, the Supreme Court granted the remedy under Article 32. However, in other cases, for example, Kappan case from the journalist from Kerala and Varavara Rao case and the social activist from Maharashtra, in those cases, the Supreme Court has asked the respective high courts to do their job. Now, the experts point out that this is not consistent. All right, and that's where the controversy is. All right, so there is an argument being made by some people that those with authority, those with power, those with pulls onto the government are able to get the Supreme Court to exercise this remedy, and others who are not as powerful or as influential are not being able to exercise this remedy. All right, so that is a criticism of the current Supreme Court's attitude to Article 32. If you come across an essay that you have to write on this, you could use George Orwell's argument, right? So George Orwell wrote this book, Animal Farm, where the pigs who control the government said, yes, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others, providing an argument for inequality in the society, right? So you could sort of hint at that argument. However, please be careful. Whenever you're writing about the Supreme Court, please be intensely respectful to the institution. Do not use crass words in talking about the Supreme Court. That's very important while you're writing your answers in your GS paper. And there is another point that you can make. For example, Rohit Day, who wrote a recent book about India's constitution, talking about how everyday Indians experience their constitution. He said the Supreme Court, Article 32 is what makes the Supreme Court a people's court. It's not an aristocratic institution, it's the people's court, because people can walk up to the Supreme Court and ask the court to enforce their fundamental rights, right? Whether they are being trampled upon by the state or in certain cases by private citizens or corporations, all right? So I hope this is more than clear. Let's move on to the next topic. The next topic is something that you must have come across again. It's to do with the CBI, right? Now, let's first understand the federal scheme of things, all right? So India is, although the constitution says it's the Union of India, however, it's been widely acknowledged that India has some sort of a federation, right? It has a federal system. Now, in our federal system, there are multiple lists, right? Union list, state list, and concurrent list. Now, police and law and order, right? Administration of law and order are state subjects, right? So the union government cannot create a police. Only the state governments can create a police. The union government can carry out arrests. The state government can carry out arrests, right? So there is a strict distinction between the powers of the union government and the powers of the state government, and policing powers fall squarely under the state list. All right, is that clear? Now, for union territories, the central government has and can implement a policing legislation, right? For Delhi Special Powers Act, right? Through Delhi Special Powers Act, the union government has created the institution of a CBI, right? However, now this CBI, which has been created under the Delhi Special Powers Act, is a national investigation agency. Its domain is the entire country. It can go into other states and investigate, right? You must have thought about it, right? Whenever there is an important public matter at stake, people say we want an independent CBI investigation. Why do this is CBI investigation? Because it's a central body and it is supposed to be investigating matters all across the country. However, it should not be taken for granted. Why? Because it's the states that have to agree, federal scheme of things, it's the states that have to agree that CBI can investigate a matter within their own domain. Recently what happened, or it's been happening for a while now, 2 to 3 years, one by one, the states are saying, we don't want CBI in our state. Like, we don't want CBI. We don't like CBI coming into our state and investigating. And now the tally of such states who have said that they don't like CBI in their state has gone up to 8 states, all right? Punjab, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, and many other states have done this. So now we're going to understand why are states doing this and what are the issues surrounding this proposition, all right? Now, I've explained to you the India's federal scheme, right? The public order and police fall squarely under the state list. So the central government cannot constitute a police force. The special police establishment was raised in terms of the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act of 1946 and is a police force for the Union Territory. Now, this is important and I want you to write this section in your answers. Section 5 of the Act allows for the center to extend the jurisdiction of the CBI to other areas, areas not in terms of jurisdiction, right? It says areas in terms of the jurisdiction. Section 6 states that this extension cannot be done without the consent of the state, all right? Without the consent of the state. You need the consent of the state, all right, for CBI to investigate a crime in your jurisdiction, all right. Now, the scheme of this act allows for it, and generally what states do is that they issue something called a general consent, all right. They say, okay, CBI can come and investigate any matter as and when they please, all right. However, even the fact that CBI can go to some other state and investigate, even that has come under constitutional scrutiny. So much so that Guwahati High Court in 2013 pretty much declared CBI unconstitutional. It said we have a federal scheme of things. CBI cannot just go into any other state and investigate a case as and when it wants, and so it's unconstitutional. Now, after its declaration as unconstitutional, the case has found itself in the Supreme Court, and proceedings are going on. So we won't know for a while if it's actually unconstitutional or not. But Section 5 and Section 6 are things that you must remember. All right. Now, what is going to be the impact of this withdrawal, right? Now that states have withdrawn their general consent, what is going to be the impact, right? So the impact is going to be this. If for cases that have already been registered and for cases wherein CBI was already investigating leads, those cases will not be impacted. It is only for the new cases that the CBI will have to seek something called as case-specific consent. All right, specific consent for that case. There is no general consent. All right, so I hope you understand this. The other part that you should sort of understand also is that even if there is no general consent, even if there is no specific consent, the CBI could sort of register cases in other jurisdictions where it has general consent and sort of use the chains of power to get investigative access to other states. So there are ways for CBI to still investigate issues. However, it just becomes much harder for CBI to do that. But the question that you should concern yourself with is the constitutional aspect of it. Do we have any other agency that has such wide-reaching national powers? We do, right? We have the National Investigation Agency, which was created through a statute, the National Investigation Agency Act of 2008, in the aftermath of Bombay terror attacks, right? Now, the extraordinary part of the NIA Act is Section 8. Section 6. We saw Section 5 and Section 6 of the CBI Act, right, of the Delhi Special Establishment Act. Now, the extraordinary part here is Section 6. What does it say? Look at the text. It stipulates that the center can take over the investigation of scheduled offences listed under the Act without requiring consent or consultation with the state government. So, the NIA could just walk into any state and just conduct investigation. Not only could conduct investigation, initiate investigations, it could also take over already existing investigations. That's the power of the NIA. Doesn't that also sort of violate the federal scheme of things? Let's examine that. But I hope you understand that this is the big difference between the Delhi Special Police Establishment Act, which governs the CBI, and the NIA Act. All right. Okay, so you would remember, if you don't remember, I'll jog your memory here. So recently, I guess long back, when WikiLeaks was coming out with a lot of stuff, it also had a mention of a conversation between the then Home Minister P. Chidambaram and Robert Mueller, who is you must have come across his name recently, but he was a federal an FBI official then. So there, P. Chidambaram on the NIA Act said to Robert Mueller that he was going perilously close to crossing constitutional limits and empowering the NIA. He said that now I'm creating this NIA and I'm not sure if this is constitutional. The power to police is with the state governments, and I am giving the NIA the power to make arrests in states, to carry out investigations. I don't know if it's constitutional. He said that in those many words, right? So we know there are questions. There are questions as to whether whatever NIA is doing is constitutional. All right. So much so, again, that Chhattisgarh government has moved a plaint under original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. It has challenged the National Investigation Agency Act, saying that it is the police was under the state list and Parliament was not competent to pass a law such as the NIA Act. We will again find out what the court says. And this is a very interesting question with respect to the federal relations of the country. In fact, last year only, the powers of the NIA have been actually strengthened, all right? It's been given more teeth, right? Now, what the new legislation what the amendment sort of says is that the officers of a certain lower rank can also carry out investigations, and its reach has been expanded to offenses like human trafficking, counterfeit currency, and cyber terrorism, right? So NIA, it's getting powerful, but we don't quite know of the constitutional basis for its power. All right, it's an interesting question, right? So now let's come to the next issue. The next issue is the Belgaum Dispute, right? Earlier known as Belgaum. Now it's a district that is straddled between Maharashtra and Karnataka. You don't need to know much about the dispute, but the fact that this dispute exists. And if you know that this dispute exists, it's enough. If there's a question in prelims paper, you're going to be able to solve it. But just the location of it will help you deal with this question, right? Belgaum, it's sandwiched between Maharashtra and Karnataka. Now, although this is under Karnataka, it has a massive Marathi-speaking population. All right, it does. Belgaum has a huge Marathi-speaking population. That's why Maharashtra has always claimed that the States Reorganization Act of 1956 was not correct in its assessment that Belgaum should belong to Karnataka. However, Karnataka has made a counter claim that it's squarely within our territory. The States Reorganization Act said so, and we are not going to give it up. All right. So you should just know that this is the dispute. Now, go through the history that I've sort of provided you. It's not that important, but just rush through this quickly. The possible thing that you might be quizzed on, or that you might be required to write in a GS answer, is the Mahajan Committee. All right, it was instituted in 1966 to assess the dispute, the situation of the dispute between Maharashtra and Karnataka, and it said that some areas like Karwad, Haliyal, and Suparna, which are small villages or hamlets in that area, that they're essentially like hamlets in that area, not exactly taluka, be given to Maharashtra, but Belgaum should be with the southern state. In 2006, the Supreme Court said, and this is important, Supreme Court said, you guys should resolve this issue politically, right? Why do you come to Supreme Court for this? All right, Supreme Court is not going to solve territorial disputes between two states, right? Like, this is a political issue. The central government should sit with the state governments and resolve it, right? And this is the argument that you're going to write in your GS paper also. You are going to say that such issues are not appropriate for the jurisdiction of courts and should be resolved politically, an argument that you can also make for river water disputes. All right, the case is still being heard by the Supreme Court. Now, you know what the issue is. You know that the Supreme Court has said that it's not ripe for juridical determination. All right, now let's come to the big issue that we're going to talk about today. You must have seen news, right? You open your TV and you see Hindi news channels and English news channels, and oh boy, there is quite a lot to digest there, right? Like loud screeching. Sometimes you must think they're not exactly saying the right thing, right? So have you ever wondered what is the regulatory atmosphere around news channels, right? Who regulates them? Like, what if they say something that is wrong? Like, let's say they say something that is not exactly religiously correct, or if they try to arouse emotions among people, right? Who takes care of that, right? And that is the question that the Supreme Court recently asked the central government. Right? There was a Sudarshan News, there is a certain Sudarshan News, and they wanted to broadcast a report about something about bureaucracy that was deemed not to be exactly in the right spirit by people, and people filed a petition in the court, and the Supreme Court said, is there any regulatory infrastructure at all? Like if some news channel tomorrow goes on air and says vile things about our country, what can we do about it, right? It's a good question that the Supreme Court asked, and we are going to understand this issue in its proper depth. All right, so let's begin with the clear assumption. The first thing you should know is that there is no regulatory mechanism for TV news channels. All right, there is no body. For example, you must have heard of Press Council of India. Press Council of India is for newspapers. For newspapers, you have Press Council of India. It's an independent body. It has good reasonable powers to control the behavior of newspapers. There is no such correlative body for TV news channels, and as surprising as that might sound, it's actually true. All right, now there is some self-regulation which I will come to next. There is a section 20 of the Cable TV Network Regulation Act 1995, and I want you to remember it. If there is a GS answer or an essay, and it is very likely media is a hot button topic, you should know that the statute exists. Now, under the statute, the government can regulate or prohibit the transmission or retransmission of any program that it feels is not in conformity with the Program and Advertising Code. Now, what is this Program and Advertising Code? There is a Cable TV Networks Regulation Act. Under this act, the government has laid out some rules. All right. Now, within those rules, there is something called a Program and Advertising Code. It's not one code, there are multiple codes, and it's under Rule 6 of the Cable TV Network Rules. All right. And if you can write that in your answer, oh boy, you're going to get some good marks for it. All right. Now, what these rules do is that they say this is what the TV channel should do and this is what the TV channel should not do. All right. However, even though this might seem as if there is a regulatory architecture for the media, there is no censorship, right? There is no body that can look at news and say this is okay and this is not okay. So there is no pre-censorship. So by the time it is aired, it is already too late. All right, it is already too late, and so these rules are pretty much dead law. No one really cares, and these rules, the code is violated almost every 20 seconds. This code is violated like so often that no one really cares. All right, so in effect, there is no real regulation of television news channels. There is an Electronic Media Monitoring Center, an EMMC, under the Information and Broadcasting Ministry, which monitors the content telecast on private TV channels to check if they adhere to the Program and Advertising Code, the code that I just told you about under Rule 6 of those rules of that legislation. All right. Now, this also is sort of very vague, right? Like no one really knows what issues they pick up, what issues they don't pick up. There is no real authority here either, right? Specific complaints can be looked into by an interministerial committee. Again, very vague. There is no real regulation here either. More importantly, there is a responsibility thrust upon the TV channels themselves, right? They have the responsibility to ensure that its programs are not violative of the programming code, of the rules, the code that I talked about. They have been given the responsibility, right? So there is an argument for self-regulation. They should regulate themselves, all right? Self-regulation. Rule 6, all right. Now, the question is, who should regulate the media? You could have an essay on this. You could have a GS question on this. And you will have to write a good answer because it's a question that's been asked around the world, not just in India, right? Who should regulate the media? Should the government regulate the media? It's never a good reason for the government to regulate Article 19 or issues emanating from Article 19, all right? Why? Because then there will be a public outcry, and it's not constitutionally right also, right? It's you could have a provision that says the government is to regulate it, but people will always push back. right? So although we saw here that there is a Section 20 of the Cable TV Networks Regulation Act, but the government would face a lot of pushback if it actually went into the regulation, the day-to-day regulation of the media, right? So there will be a public outcry, and even though government has laid down guidelines, so it's not, government has not used coercion, right? It has not said if you don't do this, we will punish you, and it has only laid down guidelines, as I illustrated to you a while back. These guidelines are mostly observed in their violation. All right. So there is a current method. There is a method. It's not a policy per se. What is happening now is that there is an element of self-regulation, and the story of this self-regulation is also very interesting. All right. So the government created something called a News Broadcasters Association as a private body in 2008 under the chairmanship of a Justice Verma. All right. And he said that I am not going to be the chairman unless I remain independent. So the government said, okay, the body will remain independent, but we are not going to meddle with whatever you say. So there was a body created called the News Broadcasters Association, which in turn set up a National Broadcasting Standards Authority, an NBSA. All right. What does it have? It has 4 representatives from among media editors and an equal number of independent members of eminence besides the chairman. All right. So it's a good body. However, the catch here is that NBSA, or the National Broadcasters Association, is a voluntary body. All right. So people join it on their own account and they can leave on their own account. Right. So what happened was there were a lot of complaints against Arnab Goswami's Republic TV for hate speech and a plethora of issues. Arnab Goswami said, I am going to form my own regulatory body, a self-regulatory body. So he formed a News Broadcasters Federation. Right? He formed his own self-regulatory body. Now you can imagine if this continues, there could be as many self-regulatory bodies as many channels there are, right? Because there is no one regulatory body, right? So in recent cases, the NBA, the National Broadcasting Authority, has requested the Supreme Court to grant recognition to NBSA. So it has requested the Supreme Court to ask the central government to give NBSA statutory recognition. All right, to have a statute that governs it, and irrespective of membership, as I told you, NBSA has news channels walking out of it all the time, right? Whenever there's a complaint and the news channel doesn't like the complaint or the ruling of the NBSA, they just walk out of it. So the NBA said to the Supreme Court that please, my lords, let our rulings be applicable to everyone. That is the only deterrent that can work. All right. And this is the only way the regulatory mechanism can be strengthened. So now you understand what is the situation of regulatory mechanism in India. There is a government regulation principle, but it doesn't work, and it should not work also. Government should not be in the business of regulating free speech. All right. Then there is a current method which is self-regulation. It doesn't work out. Why doesn't it work out? Because of splintering, right? Every time there is a adverse ruling, what people do, what news channels do, is that they walk out and they create their own self-regulatory body. All right. So you understand that. Now let's come to what about non-news channels, right? Non-news channels also can have a lot of political and free speech content, right? That can also get into hot water. So that's a good model. The non-news channels model is actually a functioning model, right? You don't find advertisements that are blatantly divisive in nature, right? If you've noticed the advertisements, everyone is sort of measured in what they advertise, right? And why is that? That's because the Indian Broadcasting Foundation adjudicates complaints against non-news channels, and that has set up a Broadcasting Content Complaints Council, a BCCC, an independent self-regulatory body. It works efficiently because everyone abides by the rulings of BCCC. All right, no one walks out of this self-regulatory body in case of an adverse ruling. However, the significant difference between non-news media and news media is that news media tends to be fairly political. There could be heated issues that are at the center of the controversy, and non-news media as opposed to the case in the United States and other countries, is not as political, right? So that's why this body has worked fine, and our regular news media regulation bodies have not worked as well, all right? So if you have to write a takeaway, a conclusion, you're going to talk on lines of independent regulation, all right? You know that media is often called the fourth estate, right? There is judiciary, there is executive, there is parliament, legislature, and media is said to be the fourth estate, the fourth pillar of democracy. Now, if we have constitutional provisions for the first three pillars of democracy, why can't we have constitutional provisions and independent constitutional authority dealing with media issues, right? Why can't we have that, right? So you could sort of talk on those terms. In your conclusion, you're going to say independent regulation is a good way forward, all right? Now, another question is online news. Now, this was something that had happened on 10th of November or 11th of November. Your Netflix, Hotstar, and online like Scroll, The Wire, a lot of online news platforms that you must continuously go to when you want to understand an issue for your UPSC preparation. What about those platforms, right? For those platforms have now been brought under government regulation under the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, and you don't need to know much except the fact that they are now under the regulatory framework of Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. All right, now let's come to another free speech issue. You must have come across the fact that Kerala government wanted to introduce an ordinance that was to criminalize online defamation. So if you go on Facebook and you type something that's horrible about a person, if it's false or something of that kind, the government can take action against you. That was the intent of the legislation. Now, what happened was, there was news, right? A Kerala, supposedly liberal state, had that ordinance, had that legislation. So there was outcry, political hue, and outcry again. So the Kerala government, I think yesterday or early morning today, took back that ordinance. It said, okay, we're not going to implement that law. Now, we must understand what just happened here, right? Why is Kerala government trying to implement this ordinance, and what are the issues around it, right? So first, what it does is that it criminalizes defamation. There is a jail time and fine, all right? Then it amended the state's police act, and this is important, to make the act of posting defamatory or humiliating content online an offense that could be punished by 3 years of imprisonment and 10,000 rupees fine. All right. The stated intent of the ordinance, as per the government, was fighting online crimes such as cyberbullying, right? And you know that the move was heavily criticized, and the Kerala High Court said so much, right? Kerala High Court said, if you come up with this ordinance, we are going to hold this unconstitutional. Now, what was Kerala government's argument? Do you remember a case by the name of Shreya Singhal, 2016? What did the Supreme Court do in that case? It struck down Section 66A of the IT Act, which was vaguely worded and gave too many powers to local police establishments, right? So the Supreme Court struck that down, saying that it's an unfair, it's not a reasonable restriction on free speech. It's vaguely worded, and it gives too much discretion to the local police authorities. That very case actually had struck down another of Kerala's legislations, a clause in another legislation of Kerala government that had purported to do pretty much something similar, all right, something similar. So Kerala has been there all through, like Shreya Singhal also. Now the Kerala government said that since the Shreya Singhal judgment, we don't know how to tackle online hate speech. Right? There is a lacuna, there is a void in the law, and we don't know how to tackle hate speech now, and there is no other legislation. So we need a new legislation, and other states have been arguing for it too. Chhattisgarh government recently has come up with a legislation, right? There are similar legislations in the pipeline in other states too. So this is an important issue that you could be quizzed on in your essay or in your GS paper or in your prelims also, all right? So let's then decode this issue, all right? What can the government? So first of all, you must recognize there is an online hate speech problem, right? People go on the internet and say vile things about others. There is harassment issues involved. Sometimes it raises religious questions, right? Bangalore incident, you must remember. So the governments need some sort of control over online speech. Some experts have argued that these new provisions are not really needed. Government already has criminalized a lot of things. The Indian Penal Code provides the government with enough tools to deal with these issues. They say we don't know why Kerala government needs new laws. We don't know why Chhattisgarh government needs new laws. There are already enough laws. In fact, there are already enough laws within the IT Act also. Look at section 67. Right? There are already, so what you will write is that the IT Act and the IPC provide enough legislative provisions for the government to clamp down on online hate speech. All right, this is the first issue. There is already enough legislation. The second issue is the vague wording, right? The Kerala legislation became sort of this infamous for the primary reason that the wording of this was insanely vague. It was very vague. If it was so vague that any police inspector or sub-inspector or investigating officer could say this is bad, it falls squarely within this legislation and let me take action on you. All right. So the Law Commission in 2017 had actually said that there should be, that section 66A of the IT Act should be replaced, but with a tightly worded provision. All right. The first issue, I'm sure you have. The second issue here is that the vagueness of the legislation. All right, that the legislation should be specific. It should deal. The language should be tight. It should deal with the particular offense and not give broad powers to the executive. All right, this is the second issue. The third issue is that the government should be consultative. Now, one of the most interesting things about this Kerala legislation, the fiasco that has happened, is that it reveals the legislative process that the governments have to go to, right? It's a badly worded legislation that was mostly drafted in haste. All right. So Kerala government felt like they just need to do this and they just drafted the legislation, and there was no real check. There was no real consultation with the wider public about this, right? So any such legislation that comes out should be widely consulted, should consult the stakeholders involved. Right? This is the third issue. All right. Let's then into private members. It has been argued. All right. So what can the government do? We've seen like what the government can do, and in your conclusion, when you're ending the conversation, it's very important that you say this, that there is no silver bullet solution to the problem of online hate speech, right? You cannot just go on criminalizing everything you want, right? Hey, there is online hate speech, have a law that says it is now criminal and the problem is not going to be solved, right? Then there is another issue that I want you to refer to, all right? Think about this. The IT Act 2008 has some rules under it, all right? Now, what do those rules say? There is an important part in those rules that lays the responsibility on intermediaries. What are these intermediaries? These are your social media platforms, right? Facebook, Google, and the companies that host servers, right? The company that can take down content, right? It actually lays the responsibility on intermediaries to do policing, right? To take down stuff that is in the box of hate speech, that is harassment, all right? So it lays the responsibility on intermediaries. The intermediaries by themselves say the government keeps asking for information all the time without following due process, all right? So neither will incessant criminalization work, nor will putting all the responsibility on intermediaries work. Instead, the government will have to strengthen the policing infrastructure, right? The first point of interaction between the citizen and the police would have to be strengthened, right? The policing cell would have to be more receptive to complaints that have to do with cyber crimes, and then the skill level of those police, the work of the policemen would have to be increased, right? There is no silver bullet solution to the problem. There was a private members bill introduced in 2018 or 2017, please check that, It was called the Social Media Regulation Bill, Social Media Responsibility Bill. What that bill said was that like the social media giants, Facebook and Google and all of these places, would now be heavily responsible for every bit of content that is put on there, and there will be an independent regulator for online content and all of that. But you should say even that won't really solve the problem, right? The problem is that our policing infrastructure is not aptly equipped to deal with cyber issues. All right. So these are the takeaways that I've just talked about. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you are reading your newspapers properly. There are a lot of issues that keep turning up. Make notes of these issues. And thank you so much for listening.